I watched the attorney's face change the way metal bends under pressure. Slow at first, then all at once. He was reading a document that was supposed to confirm his client had won everything. My father's company, his life's work. 40 years of keeping things cold so families could eat. Instead, he found a number that made no sense. 0. The company was worth 0. And his client, my stepmother, the woman who'd spent 6 years waiting for my father to die, had just inherited an empty shell. My name is Garrett Holbrook. I'm 36 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. That courtroom moment took 14 weeks to reach, but my father spent 18 months building it. Let me take you back to the beginning. I'm grateful you're here with me today. Before we begin, if stories about family and truth resonate with you, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they weren't who you thought? I read every response. A quick note, some details are adjusted for storytelling purposes. The lesson is what matters most. The attorney's face changed the way metal bends under pressure, slow at first, then all at once. I watched Wendell Thornton from across the conference table, studying every micro-expression like my father taught me to study balance sheets. Wendell was 59 years old, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He'd walked into this Mecklenburg County courthouse conference room expecting victory. His client, my father's widow, had already claimed the house, the accounts, and what she believed was control of the company. Wendell had spent the last 6 weeks acting like this probate hearing was a formality. Now he was reading page 2 of the asset schedule, and his confidence was bleeding out through his pores. His fingers stopped on the document. His jaw tightened. He flipped back to page 1, then forward again, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They wouldn't. I knew exactly what was on those pages because I'd helped my father prepare them 3 years before he died. "This can't be accurate," Wendell said, his voice losing its courtroom polish. My attorney, Clayton Ashford, didn't respond. He just waited. The way a good poker player waits when the other side is about to fold. Have you ever watched someone realize they've already lost? There's a moment, barely a heartbeat, when the truth registers before the denial kicks in. Wendell Thornton was living in that moment right now. His eyes moved across the page, but he wasn't reading anymore. He was calculating, recalculating, coming up with the same impossible answer every time. I should introduce myself. My name is Garrett Holbrook. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent the last 14 years working at my father's company in Charlotte, North Carolina. Operations director. That means I know every truck route, every maintenance schedule, every employee's birthday. I have calloused hands and my father's steady gaze. Or so people tell me. I don't smile much anymore. Not since October. That's when my father died. Wallace Holbrook was 68 years old when his heart gave out. He'd been married to Lorraine for 15 years. His second wife, 20 years younger. The kind of woman who made everyone in the room feel slightly underdressed. I never liked her. She never pretended to like me. We had an honest relationship that way. What we didn't have was a fair one. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what was at stake. My father didn't just leave behind a company. He left behind 42 years of work, 85 employees who depend on their paychecks, and a legacy that Lorraine tried to claim as her personal lottery ticket. She wanted the company liquidated, the assets divided, and her share deposited before Christmas. She got exactly what she wanted. That was her first mistake. See, my father was a lot of things. Stubborn, demanding, the kind of man who'd make you redo a job 3 times until it met his standards. then never say thank you. But he was also smart, smarter than anyone gave him credit for, including me. Especially me. He knew Lorraine would try to take everything. He knew it the day he married her, and he spent the next 15 years preparing for it. Every asset she thought she was claiming, every account she thought she was draining, every piece of the empire she thought she was dismantling, all of it was exactly where he wanted it to be. She got everything, and that was exactly the trap. Wendell Thornton finally looked up from the document. His face had gone pale beneath the courthouse fluorescence. Whatever he'd expected to find in that asset schedule, whatever promises Lorraine had made about what she was entitled to, none of it matched the reality on those pages. "We need to recess," he said. "I need to consult with my client." Clayton nodded, perfectly composed. "Take all the time you need, counselor." Wendell gathered the papers with hands that weren't quite steady. He stood, buttoned his $3,000 jacket, and walked out of the room without looking at me. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the first domino falling. I sat back in my chair and let out a breath I'd been holding for 6 weeks. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lorraine wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. And Wendell Thornton hadn't built his reputation by walking away from fights. They'd regroup, recalculate, come back with new demands and new threats. But they'd do it from a position of weakness now. They'd do it knowing that the ground they thought was solid had turned to sand beneath their feet. My father built Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions from a single repair van and a $15,000 loan. 40 years of keeping other people's products cold, while his own heart stayed warm. 85 families fed, mortgages paid, kids sent to college, all because Wallace Holbrook refused to quit when quitting made sense. And his widow started dismantling it before his body was in the ground. Let me take you back to the beginning. My father's hands told the story before his mouth ever did. Cracked knuckles, refrigerant scars, calluses that never softened even after he could afford to hire people for the rough work. Wallace Holbrook started in 1985 with a used repair van and $15,000 borrowed from his brother. He was 26 years old, newly married to my mother, and desperate in the way that makes men either dangerous or unstoppable. Dad chose unstoppable. The company wasn't built on ambition. It was built on a man who couldn't afford to fail because he had a family to feed. That first year, he worked 18-hour days, repairing walk-in coolers for restaurants that couldn't afford better. He came home smelling like compressor oil and ammonia. Hands so cold from handling refrigerant lines that my mother used to warm them between her palms before dinner. By the time I was born in 1989, he had 4 employees and a reputation for showing up when other contractors wouldn't. "Cold chain isn't glamorous," he used to say, "but people need to eat, and food doesn't keep itself." By 2000, Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions had 22 employees and contracts across the Carolinas. By 2010, 85 people keeping food cold across 3 states. Warehouses, trucking companies, restaurant chains. Anyone who needed reliable refrigeration knew Wallace Holbrook's name. If you've never watched someone build something from nothing, you don't understand what it costs. Every vacation canceled because a client's freezer failed on Christmas Eve. Every Little League game missed because the Asheville warehouse contract required a site visit. Every dinner eaten cold because the phone rang and someone needed help. I grew up understanding that the company came first. Not because my father didn't love me, but because the company was how he showed love. Every paycheck he signed meant someone else's kids got fed. Every truck he bought meant another family had stability. He carried 85 households on his shoulders, and he never complained about the weight. "A man who works with his hands understands what things are worth," he told me once when I was maybe 12, watching him rebuild a condenser in our garage. "Money's just paper, but the work, The work is real. I didn't understand then. I do now. My mother's name was Eleanor. She had red hair that she passed down to me, green eyes that she didn't, and a laugh that could fill a room without trying. She managed the books in those early years, kept my father grounded when the stress made him sharp-edged, and never once complained about the sacrifices the business demanded. She died on a Tuesday in March 2005. Sudden stroke. 16 years old. The phone call. The drive to the hospital that changed nothing. I remember standing in the hallway outside the ICU, watching my father argue with doctors who had nothing left to offer. He was 52 years old, still strong enough to lift a compressor by himself, and completely helpless. There's no tool for that kind of repair, no manual, no vendor to call. The funeral was on a Saturday. Dad wore his only suit, the one he'd bought for their anniversary dinner 3 years earlier. He shook hands, accepted condolences, thanked people for coming. He didn't cry, not once, not where anyone could see. But I heard him. 3 in the morning, a week after we buried her. I came downstairs for water and found him sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. The radio was playing softly some oldies station she used to love. He wasn't moving, just sitting there, hands flat on the table, breathing in a way that sounded like his chest might crack open. I went back upstairs. I never mentioned it. Some things aren't meant to be spoken. "We don't stop, son," he told me the next morning, already dressed for work at 6 a.m. "We build." He carried his grief in his chest like a load-bearing wall, invisible but structural. The company grew faster after Mom died, not because he wanted success, but because he couldn't stand stillness. Motion was medicine. Work was worship. Every expansion, every new contract, every employee hired, it was all monument. He was building something that would outlast him because the person he'd built his life with was already gone. I was 16 when I understood that grief doesn't disappear. It just transforms, becomes the mortar in everything you build afterward. Invisible, but holding everything together. By 2018, my father was 61 years old, running a $14 million operation, and lonelier than he'd ever admit. 13 years since Mom died. 13 years of coming home to an empty house, eating dinners alone, filling the silence with work orders and maintenance schedules. That's when Lorraine Prescott appeared. She came with a warm smile, a recent divorce, and the patience of someone who could wait years for a payoff. I met her at a Chamber of Commerce dinner where Dad was receiving some kind of service award. She was 42, polished, attentive in a way that made aging men feel seen. I watched her watch him, and something in my gut tightened. But my father was smiling for the first time in years. Who was I to take that from him? How do you explain to a grieving man that the woman making him smile might be the most dangerous thing that ever walked into his life? I didn't say anything that night at the chamber event. I watched my father lean toward this stranger with the pearl earrings and practiced warmth, and I told myself I was being paranoid. He deserved happiness. 13 years was long enough to grieve. Lorraine Prescott was 42 years old, recently divorced, working as office manager at a commercial property firm downtown. She had auburn hair, a laugh that sounded almost genuine, and a way of asking questions that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. My father called me the next morning, something he rarely did unless there was a work emergency. "I met someone interesting," he said, and his voice had a lightness I hadn't heard since before Mom died. I learned later that Lorraine had done her homework before that networking event. She knew about Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions before she ever shook my father's hand. She knew about the $14 million valuation, the 85 employees, the contracts across 3 states. Her interest in Wallace wasn't romantic curiosity. It was reconnaissance. But I didn't know that then. All I saw was my father smiling. She asked about the business like she actually wanted to know, he told me over lunch a week later. Not just polite questions, real ones. About refrigerant regulations. About the supply chain issues we've been having. Have you ever watched someone you love walk into something you can see, but they can't? You want to grab their arm, pull them back, warn them. But what do you say? Dad, this woman who makes you happy might be using you. On what evidence? A feeling. A tightness in my gut that I couldn't explain. So I said nothing. I watched. I waited. They dated for 14 months. Dinners, weekends at the lake, a trip to Savannah that Dad talked about for weeks afterward. She brought him food at the office. She remembered the names of his employees' children. She listened when he talked about Mom, never competing with the ghost, just acknowledging that Eleanor had existed and mattered. It was perfect. Too perfect. But I couldn't find the flaw. The wedding was at the Lake Norman house in the spring of 2019. Small ceremony, maybe 40 people. Dad wore a new suit. Lorraine wore ivory, not white. A choice I'm sure she'd calculated for symbolism. She was becoming a second wife, not replacing the first. Respectful. Appropriate. She treated me like a hotel concierge treats a long-term guest, professionally, predictably, with zero actual interest in who I was beyond my function. I was the son. I came with the package. She never asked about my life, my relationships, my plans. She asked about the company. Always the company. She's good for him, people kept telling me at the reception. Look how happy he is. I looked. He was happy. And I wanted to believe that was enough. The first year of their marriage, nothing changed. Lorraine moved into the Lake Norman house, redecorated a few rooms, hosted dinners for Dad's business contacts. She was charming, organized, present. When clients visited the office, she remembered their coffee orders. When employees had birthdays, she sent cards. My father praised her constantly. She really understands what it takes to run something like this, he said. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. But every conversation we had felt like a transaction. She asked questions. I answered. And then there was nothing else. No curiosity about who I was. No interest in building an actual relationship. Just data collection, filed away for purposes I couldn't identify. She had boundaries, invisible ones, and she always knew exactly where to stop. Never too familiar, never too distant. Always precisely calibrated to be pleasant without being vulnerable. I'm not telling you she was evil. I'm telling you she was patient. There's a difference. Evil makes mistakes. Patience waits until you're not watching. Within 2 years of the wedding, Lorraine had positioned herself as the company's administrative director, a title my father created for her. A salary that came from the company accounts, a corporate card that she used for everything from office supplies to restaurant dinners. She had access, full access, every vendor account, every payroll file, every bank statement that Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions generated. My father bragged to his friends that she had really stepped up, that she was handling the administrative burden he'd carried alone since Mom died. And I noticed things, small things, things that didn't add up. Mileage reimbursements for job sites she never visited, vendor invoices from companies I'd never heard of, petty cash withdrawals that nobody could explain, little numbers, hundreds here, thousands there. Nothing that would trigger alarms by itself, but they added up. Month after month, they added up. I started keeping notes. Dates, amounts, discrepancies. I didn't have proof of anything yet, just questions. Questions I couldn't ask without accusing my father's wife of stealing from him. Questions that would make me look jealous, paranoid, unable to accept that he'd moved on. So I kept watching, and she kept smiling, and the numbers kept not making sense. The first invoice that didn't make sense crossed my desk in March 2023. $47,000 to a refrigeration parts supplier I'd never heard of. I'd been tracking small discrepancies for months by then, but this was different. This was big enough to matter. I pulled the vendor file and found a company called Coastal Industrial Supply. No website, no physical address, just a P.O. box in Wilmington and a phone number that went straight to voicemail every time I called. $47,000 for parts we never received, to a company that might not exist. Between 2020 and 2023, Lorraine had made herself indispensable. Administrative Director, a title that sounded modest but meant everything. She controlled payroll. She managed vendor relationships. She processed accounts receivable and signed checks that used to require my signature. 3 days a week at the Charlotte office, a company card in her wallet, and access to every dollar my father had built over 40 years. "She's really stepped up," Dad would say whenever I visited. "Takes a load off my shoulders." I watched her signature appear on documents I used to review myself. I watched expense reports flow through without the scrutiny they'd once received. I watched my father relax into semi-retirement while his wife handled the details he'd always guarded jealously. When does loyalty to your father become betrayal of everything he built? I asked myself that question every time I added another entry to my private spreadsheet. Mileage reimbursements for routes that didn't match any job sites. Petty cash withdrawals with vague descriptions. Office supply purchases from vendors who only seemed to do business with us once, then vanished. The numbers kept adding up. By my count, somewhere north of $200,000 had disappeared into phantom invoices and unexplained expenses over 3 years. Not enough to cripple a $14 million company, just enough to fund a very comfortable secondary income. In October 2023, I finally said something. I chose my moment carefully. A Thursday afternoon, Lorraine at the Lake Norman house. Just me and Dad in his office going over quarterly projections. I'd rehearsed the conversation a dozen times. Frame it as an audit question. Don't accuse, just ask. "Dad, I've been reviewing some of the vendor accounts," I said, keeping my voice casual. "There are a few invoices I can't reconcile. Might be worth having someone take a closer look." He didn't look up from the projections. "Which vendors?" "Coastal Industrial Supply, for one. $47,000 in March. I can't find any record of the parts they supposedly delivered." The silence stretched longer than it should have. When he finally raised his eyes, they were tired. Not just from work, from carrying something he couldn't name. "Lorraine handles the vendor relationships now," he said quietly. "If there's a discrepancy, she'll sort it out." "Dad, I'm just asking questions. Some of these numbers don't add up, and I think we should—" "Then stop asking." His voice was harder than I'd heard in years. Not angry. Something worse. Weary. Resigned. Like a man who already knew something was wrong, but couldn't bear to confirm it. "I'm 66 years old," he said. "I've got maybe 10 good years left, if I'm lucky. I'm not spending whatever time I've got left auditing my own marriage." "That's not what I'm suggesting." "Yes, it is." He set down his pen and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "You think I don't notice things? You think I'm blind?" The question hung between us like smoke. "I notice," he continued. "I choose not to act. There's a difference. I've got a wife who makes me feel less alone. I've got a company that runs without me having to be here every day. I've got peace. Garrett. Maybe it's an expensive peace. Maybe it costs me some money I'll never miss. But it's peace. Dad. Drop it. I dropped it. I shouldn't have. That silence cost us both. I told myself I was respecting his wishes. I told myself he was a grown man who understood his own situation better than I did. I told myself that maybe I was wrong. Maybe the invoices had explanations I couldn't see. Maybe Lorraine really was just bad at paperwork. I knew better. But I chose silence anyway, because confronting the truth meant confronting my father. And I wasn't ready to lose him over numbers on a spreadsheet. Wallace chose love over suspicion. I chose my father over the truth. Both decisions would cost us everything. 6 months later, in April 2024, my father collapsed at the Concord facility. They rushed him to Presbyterian Hospital in Charlotte, where a cardiologist named Dr. Alderman looked at his charts and used words like congestive heart failure and significant cardiac decline. A ticking clock that couldn't be wound back. Dad spent 2 weeks in the hospital, then 3 months in careful recovery. He never returned to the office full-time. He worked from home when he felt strong enough, delegated everything else to Lorraine and me, and started making phone calls I knew nothing about. Late nights in his study, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, meetings with Clayton Ashford that weren't on any calendar I could see. My father was dying, and somewhere in those final months, while his heart was failing, Wallace Holbrook started preparing for something none of us expected. I watched my father shrink that year, not just in weight, but in the space he occupied in a room. The secret phone calls continued through early 2025, always behind closed doors, always ending when I walked in. I stopped asking. Whatever Wallace Holbrook was planning, he'd tell me when he was ready, or he wouldn't. Either way, I couldn't force it out of a dying man. His heart was giving out slowly, the way old machinery fails, still functional, but with warning lights nobody could ignore. Half-days became the norm, then half-weeks. He'd come to the Charlotte office on Monday mornings, review the schedules, make his calls in private, and go home by noon. Maybe next quarter I'll step back, he told me in February. Let you run things. He said that every quarter. He never meant it. The company was his heartbeat. Stepping back meant admitting the end was coming. And Wallace Holbrook was never good at admitting anything. Even while dying, he kept going to the office. Not to work. I handled the operations now, but he'd sit in his chair, make those mysterious phone calls, and stare at the wall like a man organizing something only he could see. I thought it was nostalgia. Turns out, it was strategy. Watching someone you love die slowly is like watching a house burn from the inside. The structure holds until it doesn't. From the outside, everything looks normal, but you can feel the heat building. You can smell the smoke nobody else notices. By summer, he couldn't make it to the office at all. Doctor's orders. Lorraine set up a workspace in the study at Lake Norman, but he barely used it. Most days he just sat on the back deck, looking at the water, talking on his phone in a voice too low for anyone to hear. I visited every Sunday. We'd sit on that deck together, drinking the coffee I brought from his favorite shop downtown, and talk about nothing important. The weather, the Panthers' chances, whether the company would survive another regulation change. We never talked about what mattered. We never said goodbye. I thought we had more time. October 2025, Tuesday morning, 6:47 a.m. The phone. 3 words. He's gone. Garrett. Lorraine's voice was flat. Not broken. Flat. like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed. I drove from my apartment in Matthews to the Lake Norman house in under 25 minutes. I don't remember the drive. I remember pulling into the driveway, seeing the ambulance lights already spinning, knowing there was nothing left to rush toward. Wallace Holbrook died in his bed at 68 years old. Cardiac arrest, they said. Quick, peaceful. His heart, which had been failing for over a year, finally stopped trying. I found Lorraine in the kitchen, already on the phone with the funeral home. Her voice was low, efficient. She was asking about availability for Friday, about catering options, about how many chairs the chapel could hold. Businesslike, in a way grief shouldn't be. She glanced up when I walked in, covered the phone's mouthpiece. "I'm so sorry, Garrett." He went peacefully. I was right beside him. Then she went back to discussing flower arrangements. I walked upstairs to his bedroom. The paramedics had already confirmed what we all knew. My father lay in bed, eyes closed, hands folded across his chest like someone had arranged them. Maybe Lorraine had. Maybe she'd positioned him for presentation before calling anyone. I stood there for a long time. I didn't know what else to do. Whatever you believe about where people go when they die, my father looked like a man who had finally rested. No more phone calls to make. No more secrets to keep. No more carrying 85 families on shoulders that had grown too tired for the weight. The funeral was held that Friday at a chapel in Cornelius. Standing room only. Employees came in work boots and borrowed ties. City officials in black suits. Old clients who remembered when Wallace Holbrook fixed their first walk-in cooler with duct tape and determination. Lorraine sat in the front row, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my first month's salary. She cried at the appropriate moments. She thanked everyone graciously. She played the grieving widow with the precision of someone who'd studied the role. I delivered the eulogy. I talked about his hands, his work ethic, the way he built something from nothing because failure wasn't an option. I didn't talk about the last year. I didn't talk about the secrets or the phone calls or the way he'd looked at me that day in his office when I asked about the invoices. Some things aren't meant for funerals. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived at my apartment door. The return address was a law firm I'd never heard of. Thornton and Associates. Downtown Charlotte. I opened it standing in my kitchen, expecting something about estate procedures or probate scheduling. Instead, I found a formal demand letter. Lorraine Holbrook, through her attorney, Wendell Thornton, was claiming full ownership of Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions under a post-nuptial agreement signed 3 years ago. She was also claiming the Lake Norman house, all personal accounts, and every asset my father had accumulated over 40 years. Everything. She wanted everything. And according to that letter, she had the paperwork to take it. I read the letter 3 times before I put it down. Post-nuptial agreement. Sole beneficiary. Full ownership of Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions. The words blurred together, but the meaning was clear. Lorraine wasn't just claiming the house and the accounts. She was claiming everything my father had spent 40 years building. Every truck, every contract, every employee who depended on their paycheck. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about the funeral. The chapel had smelled like refrigerant and lilies. My father's whole life reduced to flowers and the faint chemical trace of the work that defined him. Standing room only. People lined the walls and spilled into the hallway, waiting to pay respects to a man who had given them jobs, fixed their equipment, shown up when nobody else would. 85 employees came, not because they had to, because Wallace Holbrook had been more than a boss to them. He'd been the reason their kids went to college, the reason their mortgages got paid, the reason they could look at their families and say they had something stable. That was his legacy. Not the buildings or the bank accounts, the people. Neil Ramsey stood in the back row, jaw tight, eyes wet. He was 44 years old. Field operations manager now, but he'd started as a refrigeration tech 12 years ago when nobody else would hire him. My father gave him a chance. Neil never forgot it. He caught my eye during the service and nodded. No words. We didn't need them. If you've never buried someone who built things, you don't know what that room feels like. It's not just grief. It's responsibility. All those people looking at you, wondering if the structure that held their lives together would survive without its foundation. Lorraine sat in the front row. Black silk dress, pearl earrings, the same ones she'd worn when she first appeared in my father's life. She cried at the appropriate moments during the hymn, during my eulogy, during the final prayer. She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief that matched her dress. He gave me my first job, a technician said during the reception, shaking my hand. I was 19, didn't know a condenser from a compressor. Your father taught me everything. I thanked him. I thanked all of them. I played my role the way you're supposed to, accepting condolences, nodding at memories, pretending I wasn't watching my stepmother work the room. Lorraine moved through the reception like a diplomat at a state funeral, gracious, untouchable, performing. She touched shoulders. She held hands. She said all the right things with all the right pauses. She's holding up so well, someone whispered behind me. So strong. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But I'd watched her make phone calls to the funeral home before my father's body was cold. I'd seen her discussing flower arrangements while I stood in his bedroom, trying to understand that he was gone. Her grief arrived on schedule, hit its marks, and never once threatened to crack her composure. That should have warned me. After the reception, people lingered. Old clients wanted to share stories. Employees wanted reassurance that their jobs were safe. Neil pulled me aside near the parking lot, voice low. Whatever you need, he said. Whatever it takes to keep this company running, I'm with you. I thanked him without knowing what I was thanking him for. I didn't understand yet what was coming. Lorraine left early, said she needed to rest, said the day had been overwhelming. She drove away in the Mercedes my father had bought her for their 5th anniversary, and I watched her taillights disappear down the road, thinking she looked relieved. Not grieving. Relieved. I told myself I was being unfair. Grief does strange things to people. Maybe she processed differently. Maybe I was projecting my own anger onto someone who was just trying to survive a terrible day. I should have trusted my gut. Now, sitting in my kitchen with that certified letter in my hands, I understood. Every moment of composed grief, every perfectly timed tear, every gracious handshake, it had all been performance. She wasn't mourning my father. She was waiting for the curtain to fall so she could collect her inheritance. The post-nuptial agreement was dated 3 years ago, right around the time my father's heart started failing. Right around the time Lorraine became administrative director with access to every account. She'd planned this. Maybe from the beginning. Maybe from the moment she walked into that networking event and identified a lonely widower with a company worth millions. And now she wanted all of it. The company, the house, the accounts, everything my father built from nothing, handed over to a woman who'd spent 6 years positioning herself for exactly this moment. I picked up my phone and called the only attorney I trusted. Clayton Ashford had handled my parents' estate when my mother died. He knew the family. He knew the company. He'd know what to do. Clayton, I said when he answered. I need help, and I need it fast. His voice was calm, steady. I've been expecting your call. Your father told me you'd reach out when the time came. I stopped breathing. What do you mean? He told you. What do you mean, he told you? Clayton's voice stayed level on the other end of the line. Your father came to see me in September of last year, right after his diagnosis. He had concerns about the company, about Lorraine, about what would happen when he was gone. I gripped the phone tighter. The certified letter was still on my kitchen table, its demands burning in my mind. Sole beneficiary, full ownership, 5 business days to retrieve personal belongings. Clayton, she's claiming everything, the company, the house, all the accounts. There's a will from November 2024 that I've never seen. I know, he said. I know exactly what she's claiming. And I know what your father did about it. The eggs on my stove had burned to carbon. The smoke detector started shrieking. I walked over, turned off the burner, and opened a window without taking the phone from my ear. Tell me, I said. Not over the phone. Come to my office tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. There are documents you need to see. Things your father prepared. I hung up and sat back down at the kitchen table. The letter was written on heavy cream paper, the kind that costs money, the kind that says, "We expect to win." Wendell Thornton's signature was bold and confident at the bottom. 40 years of work, 85 employees, a company worth $14 million, all of it claimed in a single paragraph of legal language. I read the letter again. Not the legal jargon this time. I read between the lines. Pursuant to the most recently executed will, dated November 12, 2024, that was barely a year ago, a year before my father died, right when his heart was failing and Lorraine was playing nursemaid. The letter demanded that I contact their office to discuss orderly transition of personal property. Translation: your father is buried. Now get your stuff and get out. 5 business days. Like I was being evicted from a storage unit, not cut out of a 40-year legacy. The anger hit me like a furnace blast. Hot, consuming. The kind of rage that makes you want to drive to someone's house and say things you'll regret. I could feel my pulse in my temples, my hands shaking, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. 30 seconds. That's how long it lasted. Have you ever felt rage so pure it burns clean through to something colder? The anger didn't disappear, it transformed. Like metal in a forge, heated past its breaking point until it becomes something harder. I felt my brain shift into gear. This was familiar. This was the same focus I used on job sites when compressors failed at midnight, when contracts fell through, when everything went wrong at once. My father had put me in those situations deliberately. Pressure tests, he called them, seeing how I responded when the stakes were real. I'd spent 14 years learning to think clearly when everything was falling apart. I thought I was learning to run a refrigeration company. Turns out, I was learning to fight. Lorraine had planned this for years. The networking event, the courtship, the marriage, the slow embedding into company finances. She'd been patient, methodical, playing a long game while my father was still alive. She probably thought she was smarter than everyone else in the room. She didn't know my father. Wallace Holbrook had spent 40 years outworking, outthinking, and outlasting everyone who underestimated him. He'd built an empire from a single repair van and a borrowed loan. He'd survived recessions, regulations, and competitors who thought they could push him out. And according to Clayton, he'd spent his final year preparing for exactly this moment. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black, the way Dad always drank it. I sat at the table, spread the letter flat, and read it one more time, not as a victim, but as an opponent. She was claiming a will from November 2024. That meant there were earlier wills. Wills that might say something different. Wills that might have been signed when my father was healthier, clearer, less dependent on a wife who controlled his access to medication and comfort. She was claiming the company. But companies aren't just pieces of paper. They're people, contracts, relationships built over decades. You can't inherit loyalty. You can't forge institutional knowledge. She had a legal claim. I had 14 years of actually running the operation. The sun was setting over Matthews, painting my kitchen in orange light. I finished my coffee, washed the burned pan, and made a list of everything I needed to bring to Clayton's office tomorrow. I didn't know yet what my father had prepared. I didn't know if it would be enough. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Lorraine Holbrook had made the mistake of thinking Wallace's death meant the fight was over. It was just beginning. I texted Neil Ramsey 2 words. "Call me." He called back in under a minute. "What do you need?" "Everything you know about the company finances for the last 3 years. Vendor accounts, payroll records, anything Lorraine touched. Can you get it?" "I can get it tonight." "Good. I'll explain tomorrow. And Neil, don't tell anyone what you're doing." Clayton Ashford's office had photographs of 3 governors on the wall and 0 family members. The workspace of a man who solved problems for a living. I arrived at 8:27 a.m., 3 minutes early. Neil had called at midnight with preliminary findings that confirmed every suspicion I'd ever had about Lorraine's vendor accounts. But I hadn't told Clayton yet. I wanted to hear what my father had known first. Clayton was 51 years old, silver at the temples, with the kind of calm that comes from winning cases most people never hear about. He'd handled my mother's estate 20 years ago, back when the company was still small enough to fit in a single building. Now he sat behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than my first car. 2 cups of coffee already waiting. "Sit down," he said. "No small talk. No condolences, just business." I sat. "Your father came to see me 13 months ago," Clayton said. "September of last year, right after his heart started failing. He came to you before he came to me." That hurt more than I expected. All those months of watching my father decline, all those conversations where I tried to warn him about Lorraine, and he'd already known. He'd already been working the problem. He just hadn't told me. "He didn't want to alarm you," Clayton said, reading my expression. "He also didn't have proof yet, just instincts. The same instincts you had." "What kind of instincts?" Clayton opened a folder on his desk. "Your father noticed discrepancies in the company accounts starting around 2022. Small amounts at first. Vendor invoices that didn't match deliveries. Mileage reimbursements for routes that didn't exist. Petty cash withdrawals with vague documentation. I found the same things." "I know. He told me you'd raised concerns. He said you came to him with questions, and he shut you down." Clayton paused. "That was deliberate." "Deliberate. Your father didn't want Lorraine to know anyone was watching. If you'd kept digging, she might have noticed, might have covered her tracks, might have accelerated whatever she was planning." Clayton leaned back in his chair. "So he let you think he was in denial, but he was already 3 steps ahead." My father had been building a wall while his heart was failing. A wall I never knew existed. "What did you find?" I asked. "Enough to justify what he did next." Clayton pulled a second folder from his desk. This one was thicker, bound with a rubber band, filled with documents I'd never seen. "Your father was smart, Garrett. He trusted his instincts. When he realized Lorraine was systematically embezzling from the company, he didn't confront her. He didn't file police reports. He didn't do anything that would tip her off. What did he do? He restructured everything." Clayton spread the documents across his desk like a general laying out a battle map. Corporate filings, trust agreements, transfer documents, amendment after amendment, all dated between September and December of last year. Your father spent the last year of his life quietly moving every asset he'd spent 40 years building into structures that Lorraine couldn't touch. He created holding entities. He established irrevocable trusts. He transferred equipment, contracts, and intellectual property out of Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions, LLC, and into new legal structures with one common feature. What feature? You, Clayton said. Every single one of them names you as sole beneficiary. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't moved since Clayton started talking. The will, Lorraine is claiming the one from November 2024. It's real. Clayton continued. When your father did sign a will leaving everything to her. But what she doesn't understand is that by November 2024, there was nothing left in the structures that will controls. What do you mean, nothing left? What your father did in those final months was entirely legal, entirely thorough, and entirely invisible to Lorraine. The company she's claiming ownership of, Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions, LLC, still exists on paper. It still has a bank account, a business license, a federal tax ID, but the assets, the contracts, the equipment that actually runs the operation. Clayton shook his head. All of it was transferred to a holding company called Holbrook Industrial Holdings, which is owned by the Wallace Holbrook Family Trust, which names you as sole trustee and beneficiary. I stared at the documents. My father's signature on every one of them, dated and notarized while his heart was failing, while he was making those mysterious phone calls, while he was sitting in his office, not working, just organizing. She's claiming an empty shell, I said slowly. Exactly. Clayton slid a folder across the desk. The company Lorraine thinks she inherited, it owns nothing. No trucks, no contracts, no equipment, no client relationships, just a name and a business license. Inside the folder was a trust document dated October 2024. The Wallace Holbrook Family Trust. Beneath it, a corporate restructuring agreement that had transferred everything of value out of the LLC before Lorraine even knew what was happening. My father spent his last year building a fortress, I said. He spent his last year protecting everything he'd spent 40 years creating, Clayton corrected. And he spent his last year making sure that when Lorraine finally showed her hand, you'd have everything you needed to stop her. I looked at the documents. My father's final gift. So what happens now? Have you ever watched someone explain how your father outsmarted death itself? Clayton spread the documents across his desk, walking me through each one like a professor teaching a master class. Trust agreements, corporate filings, transfer documents with notarized signatures from a man whose heart was failing even as he signed them. Your father understood something most people don't, Clayton said. A company isn't the same as its legal shell. The LLC, Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions. LLC, that's just paperwork. It's a filing with the state. What actually makes a company valuable is the assets it controls. The trucks, the equipment, the contracts. Exactly. And in October 2024, 6 weeks before he wrote that will Lorraine is waving around, your father transferred every single operational asset out of the LLC and into a new entity. He slid a document toward me. Holbrook Industrial Holdings, LLC, formed October 3rd, 2024. Single member, the Wallace Holbrook Family Trust. This holding company owns everything, Clayton continued. Every refrigeration unit, every service vehicle, every client contract, every piece of equipment in every facility. The employees technically work for this entity now, not the original LLC. My father had built a house with no foundation then handed Lorraine the keys. So when he wrote the will in November, he knew exactly what he was giving her. Clayton's voice was almost admiring. The November will says Lorraine inherits 100% of Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions, LLC. And that's completely true. She does inherit it. But by November, the LLC was nothing but a name on a piece of paper. I picked up the asset transfer agreement. Page after page of equipment lists, vehicle registrations, contract assignments. Everything my father had spent 40 years accumulating, methodically moved from one legal box to another. The company she's claiming, I said slowly, has no assets. Correct. No equipment. None. No contracts. Zero. No employees. Net asset value. Zero. Zero equipment. Zero contracts. Zero employees. Zero. The employees work for Holbrook Industrial Holdings now, Clayton confirmed. They probably don't even know there was a change. Same paychecks, same work, same management. Your father handled the paperwork quietly. The only difference is which legal entity signs their checks. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the scope of what my father had done. While his heart was failing, while Lorraine was playing nursemaid and waiting for her payday, while I was keeping my head down and trying not to make waves. He'd been dismantling her victory before she even knew she'd won. The trust names you as sole beneficiary, Clayton said. I'm the trustee your father wanted someone Lorraine couldn't influence handling the legal work. But you control the underlying assets. You're the one who decides what happens to the company. And Lorraine. She gets exactly what the will says. The Lake Norman house, the personal bank accounts, and 100% ownership of a corporate shell that contains nothing but its own registration documents. He gave her everything she asked for. That was the genius of it. Can she challenge this? I asked. She can try, but your father was careful. Every transfer was properly documented. Every signature was notarized. The restructuring happened a full month before the will was executed, so there's no argument that he didn't know what he was doing. Clayton paused. And, most importantly, there's no legal requirement that a company have assets when you inherit it. Lorraine is entitled to exactly what Wallace left her. It's not his fault, or yours, that what he left her turned out to be worthless. I thought about Wendell Thornton, sitting in his expensive office, preparing to deliver his client the spoils of her 6-year campaign. He was about to discover that his client had inherited a company worth absolutely nothing. Here's what I'm recommending, Clayton said, leaning forward. Don't fight this in a way that looks like a fight. Do the opposite. Agree to everything. Give Lorraine exactly what the November will says. The house, the accounts, the LLC, contest nothing. Won't that look like I'm giving up? That's exactly what it will look like. And that's the point. Clayton's eyes were sharp. Let Wendell Thornton walk into probate court expecting victory. Let him present the will. Let him claim ownership of the company on Lorraine's behalf. And then, when he opens the books, let him discover for himself that his client inherited the letterhead and nothing else. You want him to spring the trap on himself. I want him to announce to a judge that his client is the proud owner of a worthless shell corporation. I want it on record. I want Lorraine to realize, in open court, that the man she married was 3 steps ahead of her the entire time. I looked at the documents spread across Clayton's desk. My father's final move. His last lesson. When does the probate hearing happen? 3 weeks, November 14th, Mecklenburg County Courthouse. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of pretending I'd lost. 3 weeks of letting Lorraine believe she'd won. And after the hearing, We present the trust documents. We show the court that all operational assets were legally transferred before the will was executed. And we watch Wendell Thornton try to explain to his client why she spent 6 years scheming for an empty box. I picked up the trust agreement. My father's signature at the bottom. "Do it," I said. Exactly the way he planned. The strategy sounded like surrender until I understood it was the opposite. I left Clayton's office with copies of every document my father had prepared. Trust agreements, transfer records, corporate filings, the paper trail of a man who knew he was dying and refused to let that be the end of the story. She's going to fight this. Clayton had warned me before I walked out. When she discovers what the LLC is actually worth, she'll argue fraudulent transfer. She'll claim your father moved assets specifically to disinherit her. Can she win? Not easily. The restructuring is clean. Your father documented everything. He had legitimate business reasons for every transfer. Tax efficiency, liability protection, succession planning. None of it was done to defraud anyone. But she'll try. And when she does, we'll be ready. The strategy wasn't about avoiding a fight. It was about choosing the battlefield where Lorraine would lose before she even knew combat had started. By agreeing to everything in the will, we'd force Wendell Thornton to claim victory in open court. He'd announce that his client now owned the company. He'd file the paperwork. He'd make it official. And then he'd open the books and find nothing. When someone hands you a loaded weapon and tells you not to fire it, do you trust them? I trusted Clayton because my father had trusted him, and I trusted my father because 40 years of evidence suggested he knew what he was doing. I drove home to Matthews with the windows down, letting the October air clear my head. The trees along I-85 were just starting to turn, hints of gold appearing at the edges. My father wouldn't see another fall. He'd planned all of this, knowing he wouldn't be here to watch it unfold. That evening, I sat on my back patio and watched the Carolina sunset paint the sky copper and gold. The air smelled like wood smoke and dying leaves. Somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was grilling. Normal sounds, normal life, as if the world hadn't just shifted under my feet. I thought about my father in his study those last months, making calls I couldn't hear, signing documents I didn't know existed. I'd assumed he was in denial about Lorraine. Assumed he was too tired to fight. Assumed he'd given up. The sunset burned copper and gold. Carolina doesn't soften anything. It just shows you what's real. He hadn't given up. He'd been working while his heart was failing. While Lorraine was counting down the days until her inheritance, while I was keeping my head down, trying not to make waves, my father had been building one last thing, a fortress, a trap, a gift. I'd spent my whole adult life learning from him how to run a crew, how to read a contract, how to spot a bad deal before it cost you money. I thought those lessons were about business. Turns out they were about everything. He had been dying, and instead of raging against it, he had been building. The sky faded from gold to purple to black. Stars appeared, scattered across the darkness like promises nobody had made yet. I finished my beer, set the bottle on the railing, and said the only thing that felt true. "I've got it from here, Dad." The night didn't answer. It just held its silence, the way my father would have. 3 days passed. I went to work. I met with Neil, reviewed the financial records he'd gathered, confirmed everything Clayton had told me about the asset transfers. The documentation was meticulous. My father had been thorough in ways I was only beginning to understand. Then Lorraine reached out. After all the lawyers and certified letters, she sent a text. My phone buzzed while I was making coffee, and there it was, her name on my screen for the first time since the funeral. "Garrett, I'd appreciate if we could handle this like adults. Wendell will be in touch about the transition. Handle this like adults. The woman who'd demanded I vacate my father's legacy within 5 business days now wanted civility. The woman who'd spent 6 years positioning herself for exactly this moment now wanted to pretend we were reasonable people having a reasonable disagreement. I set my phone down and made breakfast. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. The same breakfast my father made every morning for as long as I could remember. The same breakfast I'd watched him prepare 1,000 times. Standing at the stove in his work clothes, already thinking about the day ahead. I didn't answer Lorraine's text. There was nothing to say that Clayton wouldn't say better in legal language, but I appreciated the irony. She thought she was being generous, offering to handle things civilly. She had no idea she was walking into a courtroom where her victory would evaporate the moment someone opened a balance sheet. My father had given her exactly what she wanted. The will, the company, the legal claim she'd spent years engineering. He'd just made sure it was worthless first. I finished my coffee, washed my dishes, and went to work. 3 weeks until the hearing. 3 weeks of pretending everything was normal. 3 weeks until Wendell Thornton discovered what my father had really left behind. I responded to Lorraine's text with exactly 4 words. Of course. Take care. Then I set my phone down and went back to making breakfast. Let her interpret that however she wanted. Let her think I was defeated, compliant, ready to hand over everything without a fight. The less she expected, the harder the truth would hit. 2 days later, she texted again. I'm glad we can be civil about this. Wendell will handle the legal details. I typed back with the same careful neutrality. I think we can still have a relationship. As family. The irony of that statement should have made me laugh. Instead, I just felt tired. Lorraine had spent 6 years pretending to be family, while methodically positioning herself to take everything. Now I was pretending right back. The difference was, I knew the truth about both of us. Her request for civility revealed something important. She'd expected me to fight. She'd braced for angry phone calls, contested documents, maybe even threats. My compliance confused her. Made her wonder if I knew something she didn't, but she couldn't figure out what. Have you ever agreed with someone so completely that it made them nervous? That's what we did to Wendell Thornton. Clayton called him the following week to discuss the transition, and the conversation went exactly the way we'd planned. Any attempt to contest this will be met with aggressive litigation, Wendell said, his voice sharp with practiced threat. My client has clear legal claim to the entire estate, and we will pursue every available remedy if your client attempts to obstruct. Clayton let the silence stretch for a moment. Then he said calmly, Garrett doesn't intend to contest. He'll comply in full with the terms of the November will. The pause on Wendell's end lasted 3 full seconds. 3 seconds of a man recalculating his entire strategy. That's reasonable. He sounded almost disappointed. I'll inform my client. Please do. We're prepared to sign transfer documents as soon as they're ready. The house, the accounts, the company, whatever the will specifies. Wendell had brought a sword to a room where nobody was fighting. Is there something I should know? He asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Your client seemed quite attached to his father's company. This level of cooperation is unexpected. Garrett recognizes the validity of the will, Clayton said smoothly. Own'd rather preserve family relationships than spend years in litigation. I'm sure you understand. Wendell didn't understand. That was the point. He'd prepared for scorched earth warfare. He'd sharpened his arguments about spousal rights and testamentary intent. He'd probably even drafted motions to file the moment we pushed back. And we gave him nothing to push against. Clayton called me that afternoon to relay the conversation. I was at the Concord facility, walking the floor with Neil, making sure operations continued smoothly while the legal drama played out in the background. "He's suspicious," Clayton said, "but he can't figure out why we're not fighting. His client is pushing for a quick hearing. She wants this done before you change your mind." "How quick?" 2 weeks, November 14th, Mecklenburg County. 2 weeks. Lorraine wanted this resolved fast because she was afraid I might wake up and start resisting. She didn't realize that speed worked in our favor. The faster the hearing came, the less time for anyone to examine the company's actual assets. "Tell him we'll be there," I said. "Agreeable and cooperative." He asked if we wanted to review the asset schedule before the hearing. Standard due diligence. "What did you tell him?" "That we trusted the documentation Lorraine's team would provide." I smiled at that. We were trusting them to provide exactly what we wanted them to provide. A list of assets that no longer existed in the structure they were claiming. The best trap is one the prey walks into willingly. "There's one more thing," Clayton said. "Wendell suggested his client might be willing to offer you a small settlement, a gesture of goodwill. Some personal items from the house. Maybe a modest cash payment." "What did you say?" "I said we'd consider it. A settlement offer." Lorraine was so confident in her position that she was prepared to throw me scraps. The house, the accounts, the company worth millions, all hers. But maybe she'd let me keep my father's watch, if I asked nicely. I thought about her at the funeral, crying on cue, thanking mourners with rehearsed warmth. I thought about her texting me requests for civility after sending certified letters demanding I vacate my father's legacy. I thought about 6 years of phantom invoices and missing funds, and the patience of someone who could wait for a dying man to die. "We won't be accepting any settlements," I said. "I know, but let her think we might." Clayton understood. Every gesture of cooperation made Lorraine more confident. Every sign of weakness convinced her she'd already won. And the more certain she was of victory, the harder the fall would be when the truth came out. 2 weeks, 14 days of waiting, working, pretending everything was normal. I hung up the phone and watched Neil's crew load a refrigeration unit onto a service truck. Same work my father had done 40 years ago. Same commitment to keeping things running. Then let's give her exactly what she wants. Wendell Thornton suggested a full asset review before the hearing. Lorraine laughed and told him not to waste billable hours on paperwork she'd managed herself for 5 years. I learned this later from Clayton, who heard it from a paralegal at Wendell's firm. The legal community in Charlotte isn't that large. Word travels. Standard due diligence, Wendell had said. We should verify the company's current asset position before claiming ownership. I managed those books, Lorraine replied. I know what they're worth. Even so, it's prudent to... Is a waste of time. Schedule the hearing. And that was the end of the discussion. Lorraine's years of controlling the company finances had given her absolute confidence in what she was claiming. She'd seen the equipment lists, the contract values, the accounts receivable. She knew exactly what Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions was worth. She just didn't know it wasn't the company anymore. The books she'd managed, the assets she'd tracked, the value she'd calculated, all of it had been transferred out 13 months before she demanded them. She was claiming a corporation that existed only on paper, and she was too confident to check. That was the flaw in her plan. She'd spent so long watching the numbers that she never noticed when the numbers stopped meaning anything. While Lorraine prepared her victory lap, I kept running the actual operation. The Concord facility hummed along like it always had. Service calls went out on schedule. Maintenance contracts were fulfilled. Trucks rolled every morning, carrying coal into a world that needed it. The business my father spent 40 years building continued without interruption, insulated from the legal drama by a corporate structure nobody else knew existed. "How's the crew?" I asked Neil one morning, walking the warehouse floor together. Steady. They know something's happening, rumors about the estate. Lawyers calling. But the work keeps coming, and the paychecks keep clearing. The business hummed like it always had. Compressors running, trucks rolling, cold chain intact. That's all that matters, I said. Neil nodded, but I could see the question in his eyes. He'd gathered those financial records for me weeks ago. He knew I was planning something, but he trusted me enough not to ask. The hearing's next week, I told him. After that, things might get complicated for a while, but the work won't stop. The employees won't miss a paycheck. I promise you that. I believe you. He paused. Your father would be proud, you know, the way you've handled all this. I didn't know what to say to that. Pride wasn't what I was feeling. Just focus. Just the steady discipline of doing what needed to be done. The holding company structure my father created kept everything separate. Holbrook Industrial Holdings paid the salaries, owned the equipment, held the contracts. Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions, LLC, the shell Lorraine was claiming, had no employees, no assets, no operational function at all. It was two different worlds that happened to share a name. 85 families were depending on paychecks that Lorraine didn't even know existed in a different account. She thought she was inheriting an empire. She was inheriting a filing cabinet. The week before the hearing, I went through my father's office one more time. Not the office at the company that belonged to the holding entity now. His home office in the Lake Norman house. The one Lorraine would soon own. She'd let me collect personal items, at least. Or her lawyer had insisted she let me. I took the photographs from his desk. The coffee mug with the chipped handle that he'd used for 20 years. A folder of handwritten notes, supply lists, phone numbers, reminders in his cramped handwriting. I didn't take the furniture or the art. I didn't take anything that might look valuable. Just the things that mattered. Just the pieces of my father that couldn't be appraised. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, November 14th, Mecklenburg County Courthouse, downtown Charlotte. The same building where I'd watched Wendell Thornton's confidence crumble when he opened that asset schedule. Though that moment was still in the future, still waiting for us to arrive. Clayton prepared the transfer documents with meticulous care. Clean, uncontested, exactly what Lorraine had demanded. Every signature line ready, every legal formality observed. If anyone reviewed the paperwork, they'd see nothing but compliance. The trap wasn't in the documents. The trap was in what the documents actually had transferred. Thursday morning, I put on the same gray blazer I'd worn to my father's funeral. It still fit. I'd lost weight since then. Stress, probably. Or maybe just forgetting to eat. I knotted my tie the way Dad taught me when I was 15. Loop and pull. Make it sharp. In the mirror, I saw his eyes looking back at me. The same steady gaze he'd worn in every crisis I'd ever watched him handle. Don't panic. Don't react. Just solve the problem. I thought about Lorraine waking up in the Lake Norman house, putting on her most dignified outfit, practicing her expressions of gracious victory. She probably had a speech prepared, something about honoring Wallace's memory while moving forward with her life. She had no idea what was coming. I picked up my keys and headed for the courthouse. It was time to give her everything she wanted. The morning of the hearing, I made my father's breakfast one more time. Eggs, toast, black coffee, no butter. I stood at my kitchen counter in Matthews, watching the eggs set in the pan, and realized I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. The anxiety that had followed me for weeks was gone, replaced by something quieter. Something that felt like completion. This wasn't my fight. It was my father's. I was just the one who'd be there when it finished. I ate at the table where I'd read Lorraine's demand letter a month ago. Same chair, same view of the backyard. Everything different now. Back then, I'd thought I was losing everything. Now I understood I was about to reclaim it. The coffee tasted the way my father's always had, bitter, strong. The kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. He'd drunk 3 cups every morning before work. Said it kept him sharp. Say a man who couldn't handle black coffee couldn't handle much else. I finished my breakfast, washed the dishes, and checked my watch. Time to go. The drive downtown took 20 minutes. I parked on Trade Street, 2 blocks from the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. The November air was cool, but the sun was already warm. That Carolina combination that makes you question what season you're in. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, I need you to understand what was at stake. If you're still with me at this point, drop your prediction in the comments. Do you think Lorraine figured out the trap, or did she walk in blind? A quick note, the next section includes some dramatized details for emotional impact. What matters is the message behind it. I walked 2 blocks to the courthouse, past lawyers in suits and clerks on coffee breaks. The building looked like any government structure, concrete and glass, flags out front, metal detectors at the entrance. But inside was the moment my father had been building toward for 13 months. Clayton was waiting in the hallway outside the hearing room. He wore a navy suit, conservative tie, the uniform of a man who knew how to win without looking like he was trying. A leather folder sat tucked under his arm, the transfer documents, the trust agreements, everything we needed. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like my father's still in the room." Clayton smiled, just slightly. "He is. He built the room." We found a bench in the hallway and sat down to wait. The courthouse hummed with activity around us. Footsteps, conversations, the distant sound of elevator doors. Normal morning sounds. Nobody knew what was about to happen in hearing room C. "Any word from their side?" I asked. "Wendell called yesterday. Wanted to confirm we weren't planning any surprises." "What did you tell him?" "That we were fully compliant with the will's terms." Clayton's expression didn't change, which is completely true. I thought about Lorraine preparing for today. The outfit she'd chosen, probably laid out last night. The victory speech she'd rehearsed. The plans she'd already made for the company she thought she was claiming. She'd spent 6 years positioning herself for this moment. 6 years of patience, of calculated warmth, of waiting for a dying man to die. And now she was about to collect, except she wasn't. Clayton nodded at me. No words needed. We both knew what was in that folder. At 8:40, the hearing room doors opened from the inside. A clerk stepped out, checked her clipboard, and nodded toward us. "Holbrook Estate, you can come in now." We stood. Clayton straightened his tie. I buttoned my jacket. Then Lorraine arrived. She came down the hallway with Wendell Thornton beside her, both walking with the measured confidence of people who expected to win. Lorraine was dressed in black silk and pearls, the same combination she'd worn to my father's funeral. The full presentation of a widow about to claim an empire. Wendell carried a briefcase that probably held the same documents we'd provided. The will, the asset schedule, the corporate ownership papers. Everything that proved his client was entitled to what she was demanding. Lorraine saw me across the hallway. She slowed her walk, adjusted her expression, and did something I hadn't expected. She smiled. Not a warm smile, not a genuine one, but a smile nonetheless. The kind you give someone you've beaten when you want them to know you're being gracious about it. "Garrett," she said, "I'm glad we could settle this without ugliness." "So am I," I replied. We walked into the hearing room together, widow and stepson, opponents dressed as family. The judge's bench sat empty at the front. A court reporter waited in the corner, fingers poised over her machine. Clayton and I took seats on the right side of the aisle. Wendell and Lorraine settled on the left. The clerk arranged papers at the front of the room. Lorraine looked over at me one more time, that same gracious smile still in place. She had no idea what was coming. In 10 minutes, she would find out exactly what my father had left her. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for the judge. Wendell Thornton set his briefcase on the table like a man who'd brought artillery to a negotiation, then slowly realized there was no one to shoot. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the American flag and North Carolina flag flanking the judge's bench. A court reporter sat in the corner, fingers ready. The clerk had already arranged the filings on the judge's desk. Lorraine took her seat with the composure of a woman about to be confirmed in possession of everything she'd spent 6 years pursuing. She smoothed her black silk dress, adjusted her pearls, and folded her hands on the table in front of her, the picture of dignified widowhood. Wendell arranged his documents with theatrical precision. The will, the asset schedule, the corporate ownership papers, everything organized, tabbed, ready for presentation. He exchanged a glance with Lorraine. Victory was moments away. I sat on the other side of the aisle and didn't look at either of them. Lorraine's confidence was so complete she didn't notice. Not the anger she might have expected. Not the defeat she'd hoped for. Nothing. I kept my eyes forward, my hands still, my expression neutral. Let her think whatever she wanted. It wouldn't matter in 10 minutes. The hearing room was quiet, the way a room gets before a verdict, everyone waiting for something to break. At 9:02, Judge Harmon entered through a side door. She was a silver-haired woman in her 60s, with the patient demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of family destroy itself over money. She settled into her chair, reviewed the filings briefly, and looked up at both tables. "Good morning. We're here on the matter of the Wallace Holbrook estate." Her voice was measured, neither warm nor cold. "I've reviewed the submitted documentation. The November 2024 will appears properly executed and witnessed. Before we proceed, are there any preliminary matters?" Wendell rose smoothly. "None from the petitioner, Your Honor. Mrs. Holbrook is prepared to accept the estate transfer as specified in her late husband's will." Judge Harmon nodded, then turned to our side of the room. "Mr. Ashford." Clayton stood with the same unhurried calm he'd shown since the day I walked into his office. "No preliminary matters, Your Honor." "Very well." The judge made a note. "Mr. Thornton, you may proceed with presenting the will's terms." Wendell launched into his presentation. The will, the marriage, the clear language naming Lorraine Holbrook as sole beneficiary. He read key passages aloud, cited relevant statutes, explained why the document was unambiguous. It was a performance polished, professional, designed to establish his client's absolute right to everything. I watched him work. 59 years old, silver hair, expensive suit. He was good at his job. He just didn't know he was arguing for ownership of an empty box. Have you ever watched someone win and not realize they've already lost? "The will clearly states," Wendell continued, "that all of Mr. Holbrook's assets, including 100% ownership of Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions LLC, pass to his surviving spouse. There is no ambiguity, no competing claims. Mrs. Holbrook is entitled to immediate transfer of all property and business interests." Judge Harmon listened without expression. When Wendell finished, she turned to Clayton. "Mr. Ashford, does your client have any objections to the transfer as described?" This was the moment, the hinge point. Everything my father had built was about to pay off. Clayton rose again, buttoning his jacket with casual precision. "None, Your Honor. Mr. Holbrook is in full agreement with the transfer." "Oh." The silence lasted 2 full seconds. Wendell's pen stopped moving. He looked at Clayton like a man who'd missed something important, but couldn't figure out what. His instincts were screaming. I could see it in the slight tension around his eyes. But there was nothing to fight. We'd agreed to everything. Lorraine's expression flickered, just for a moment. She'd expected resistance. She'd prepared for accusations, arguments, maybe tears. Full agreement wasn't in her script. "Let me be clear," Judge Harmon said, looking at me directly. "Mr. Holbrook, you consent to the transfer of all assets as specified in your father's will, the residence, the financial accounts, and the business interests." I stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I consent." No objections. Full consent. The trap was set. All that remained was the trigger. Judge Harmon nodded, made another note, and signed the transfer order. Just like that. A stroke of her pen, and Lorraine Holbrook officially owned everything my father had left her. Except she didn't. She just didn't know it yet. "The transfer is approved," the judge said. "Mr. Thornton, please ensure your client receives the certified documentation. And for the record, I'll need confirmation that the business asset schedule has been reviewed and accepted." "Of course, Your Honor." Wendell reached for the asset schedule, the supporting documentation that itemized exactly what Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions, LLC, contained. Standard procedure, routine paperwork. He'd probably glanced at it before, but now he needed to formally confirm its contents for the court record. He opened the folder. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He stopped. The color drained from his face like water from a broken pipe. His fingers tightened on the paper. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. And I watched the moment land. I watched Wendell Thornton's face change the way metal bends under stress. Slow at first, then catastrophically. His eyes moved across the asset schedule. First page, routine review. Second page, slight hesitation. Then he went back to the first page, read the same line again, removed his reading glasses, folded them with deliberate care, set them on the table like a man buying time to think. The hearing room was silent, except for the court reporter's quiet breathing. Wendell picked up the document again. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightened. I watched his eyes scan the same line 3 times, as if repetition might change what it said. It wouldn't. The confident litigator who'd threatened scorched earth litigation, who'd prepared for every argument and anticipated every objection, was now holding a document that had just incinerated his entire case. And he couldn't understand how. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Harmon's voice cut through the silence. "Is there a problem with the documentation?" Wendell didn't answer immediately. His face changed the way a structure changes when a load-bearing element fails, not all at once, but progressively, as reality caught up with assumption. First confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching horror. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I need a moment to review this with my client." "The asset schedule is a standard filing," the judge said. "Is there an issue with its accuracy?" Wendell looked at Clayton. Clayton looked back. Neither said a word. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was counting seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 seconds of silence in a courtroom is a very long time. Finally, Wendell turned to Lorraine. She was still sitting with that composed widow's posture, but I could see concern creeping into her eyes. She didn't know what her attorney had just read. She only knew something had gone wrong. "Lorraine," Wendell said quietly, "we need to step outside." "What's happening?" Her voice was low but sharp. "Just tell me." Wendell didn't answer. He gathered the asset schedule with hands that weren't quite steady and turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess. 10 minutes. Judge Harmon looked at Clayton. "Mr. Ashford, No objection, Your Honor. Recess granted. 10 minutes. Wendell stood, took Lorraine's arm, and guided her toward the hallway door. She went with him. But I could see the questions building behind her eyes. The controlled composure she'd worn like armor was starting to show cracks. The door closed behind them. Clayton leaned back in his chair. That went well, he said quietly. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to exhaustion. The kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for weeks and finally get to exhale. What happens now? Now she reads the document. Then she comes back in here and tries to figure out how to salvage something. Through the narrow glass panel beside the door, I could see them in the hallway. Wendell was showing Lorraine the asset schedule, pointing to specific lines, explaining in low tones what the numbers meant. 0, 0, 0, 0. Every line on that schedule read the same number. Net asset value following October 2024 restructuring, $0.00. No equipment, no vehicles, no contracts, no accounts receivable, no inventory, no employees. The LLC she'd just legally inherited contained nothing but its own corporate registration. I watched Lorraine's face through the glass. She read the first page. Her head came up sharply. She said something to Wendell. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clear. He responded, gesturing at the document, probably explaining the restructuring timeline. She read the second page. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something darker. And then the mask cracked. The composed widow, the gracious hostess, the patient schemer who'd spent 6 years positioning herself for exactly this moment, all of it fell away. What remained was rage, pure, unfiltered, desperate rage. She turned toward the glass panel. Our eyes met through the narrow window. I held her gaze. I didn't look away. I didn't smile. I just let her see that I knew, that I'd always known, that my father had known too. Wallace Holbrook had given her exactly what she demanded. The will, the company, the legal victory she'd worked so hard to engineer. He'd given her everything, and the giving was the weapon. Lorraine pushed through the door before Wendell could stop her. She crossed the hearing room in 4 steps, heels clicking on the tile floor, document crumpled in her fist. What did you do? Her voice was barely controlled. What did you do to my company? I stood slowly, buttoned my jacket, met her eyes. It's not your company, Lorraine. It never was. Your Honor! Wendell hurried in behind her, trying to restore order. The assets are gone, Lorraine said, ignoring him. Transferred out. The equipment, the contracts, everything. Where did it go? Judge Harmon was watching this unfold with the patient expression of someone who'd seen family money destroy people before. Mrs. Holbrook, she said calmly, please take your seat. If there's a legal issue with the asset schedule, your attorney can address it through proper channels. But Lorraine wasn't listening to the judge. She was staring at me with 6 years of wasted effort burning in her eyes. What did you do? Lorraine's voice echoed in the hearing room. The composure she'd worn for 6 years was gone. In its place was something raw, the fury of a woman who'd just watched her fortune evaporate. What did you do to that company? Wendell reached for her arm. Lorraine, please. She shook him off without looking at him. Her eyes were locked on mine. The gracious widow, the patient schemer, the woman who'd cried on cue at my father's funeral. All of it had fallen away. The mask was gone. What remained was the real Lorraine, calculating, furious, and finally visible. I want to know what he did, she said, her voice barely controlled. That asset schedule is wrong. It has to be wrong. The company was worth millions. I managed those accounts for 5 years. I know exactly what was in them. Judge Harmon cleared her throat. Mrs. Holbrook, if you have concerns about the accuracy of the documentation, there are proper legal channels. The documentation is accurate, I said. Everyone in the room looked at me. Lorraine's jaw tightened. That's impossible, she said. The equipment alone was worth— I didn't do anything to the company, Lorraine. I kept my voice level. My father did. 18 months ago. The silence stretched. Lorraine's breathing changed shorter, sharper. The controlled rhythm of someone fighting to stay composed. That's a lie. It's documented, Clayton said, rising from his seat. Mr. Holbrook restructured his business holdings in October 2024. He created a new entity, Holbrook Industrial Holdings, and transferred all operational assets into it. The restructuring was completed before the November will was ever drafted. 18 months. My father had seen her coming for 18 months. That's fraud, Lorraine said, her voice rising. That's illegal. He stripped the assets specifically to protect his business, Clayton finished smoothly, which is the legal right of any owner. The restructuring had legitimate business purposes, liability protection, succession planning, tax efficiency. All documented, all properly executed. You're telling me he deliberately— I'm telling you he made legal decisions about his own property. Clayton's tone never changed. Calm, professional, unshakable. The LLC named in the November will received exactly what it contained at the time of transfer: corporate registration documents, a business license, and 0 operational assets. Lorraine stood frozen in the center of the hearing room. I watched her process the implications. 6 years of patience, 6 years of positioning. All of it for nothing. Your Honor, Wendell said, finally stepping forward. I'd like to request additional time to review these restructuring documents. If the deceased made asset transfers with the specific intent to defraud his spouse, then that would be a matter for separate litigation, Judge Harmon said. This hearing concerns the transfer of assets as specified in the will. Those assets have been identified and documented. The transfer is approved as filed, but— Mr. Thornton. The judge's voice carried the weight of someone who wasn't going to repeat herself. If your client wishes to challenge the restructuring, she may file the appropriate motions. But that is not what we're here to decide today. Wendell looked at Lorraine. Lorraine looked at me. I looked back without expression. Your client, Clayton added quietly, would need to demonstrate that Mr. Holbrook made those transfers specifically to defraud her, which would require explaining why he might have had reason to believe fraud protection was necessary. The words landed like a trap closing. Lorraine understood immediately. If she claimed my father moved assets to keep them from her, she'd have to explain why he might have wanted to do that. And that explanation would lead directly to questions about phantom invoices, missing funds, and years of systematic embezzlement. He did this to protect his business. Whether you see those as the same thing is a matter of perspective. Lorraine sat down. She was breathing in the measured way people breathe when they're preventing themselves from screaming. Wendell whispered something in her ear. She didn't respond. The proceedings resumed. Judge Harmon completed the formalities. The transfer of Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions, LLC, the empty shell, the 0-asset entity, was formally approved and documented. Lorraine Holbrook was now the legal owner of a corporate registration worth nothing. She got everything she asked for. Afterward, in the parking garage, Clayton and I walked to our cars in silence. The November air was cool, carrying the smell of exhaust and concrete. Our footsteps echoed off the walls. She's going to fight this, Clayton said finally. I know. She'll file an elective share claim. argue that the restructuring was designed to deprive her of marital property, try to claw back the assets. Can she win? Clayton stopped beside his car, keys in hand. Not easily. Your father documented everything. But the legal process will be ugly. Discovery motions, depositions, forensic accounting. Forensic accounting. Yes. A small smile crossed Clayton's face. If she wants to argue the company was more valuable than what she received, she'll have to open the books, all of them, including the ones she managed for 5 years. I understood then. The trap wasn't just the empty shell. The trap was what came next. Let her fight, I said. Let her open every book she ever touched. Clayton nodded. That's exactly what your father would have said. The parking garage was empty, except for us. November sun cutting through the concrete gaps. And Clayton was already explaining why Lorraine's next move would be her last mistake. We stood beside his car, voices low, the sound of traffic filtering down from the street above. The hearing was over. The transfer was complete. But we both knew this was just the opening move. She'll argue fraudulent transfer, Clayton said. That your father stripped assets specifically to defeat her spousal inheritance rights. Under North Carolina law, she can file an elective share claim within 6 months. Can she win? Not easily. The timing is clean restructuring completed a full month before the will was executed. The documentation is thorough. Your father had legitimate business reasons for every transfer. Clayton paused. But the real protection isn't the legal argument. It's what we have in reserve, the records he compiled. Exactly. Wallace didn't just restructure the company. He built an audit trail. He documented every discrepancy he found in the books Lorraine managed. He compiled evidence he could have used to confront her, but chose to use as insurance instead. I want to pause here and tell you something about grief and clarity. They're not opposites. They can exist in the same body at the same time. I was mourning my father while also recognizing, maybe for the first time, the full scope of what he'd done. He hadn't just prepared for Lorraine's attack. He'd designed a counterattack that would only trigger if she pushed. The documentation wasn't just defensive, I said slowly. It was a trap. Your father was a careful man. Clayton unlocked his car door but didn't get in. He understood that the best legal position isn't just having the right answer. It's making sure the other side destroys themselves, trying to prove you wrong. Within 30 days, Wendell Thornton filed the elective share claim we'd predicted. Lorraine Holbrook, surviving spouse, argued that Wallace had fraudulently divested marital property to deprive her of her lawful inheritance. She demanded the court set aside the October 2024 restructuring and award her a fair share of the company's true value. The legal process ground forward like machinery, slow, expensive, and indifferent to emotion. Depositions were scheduled. Document productions piled up on Clayton's desk. Both sides exchanged interrogatories, requests for admission, motions and counter-motions. The attorneys billed hours that probably rivaled the value of what was being fought over. I kept running the company, the real company, the one that actually had assets and employees and contracts. Holbrook Industrial Holdings continued operations without interruption. Paychecks cleared. Service calls went out. The business my father built kept doing what it had always done, keeping things cold. Lorraine, meanwhile, was fighting for a shell. She hired a forensic accountant, Clayton reported in early December, calling me from his office. He's going through the company records looking for evidence of fraud. Will they find anything? They'll find something. I could hear the careful satisfaction in his voice. Just not what she's hoping for. The forensic accountant Lorraine hired was good. His name was Marcus Bell, according to Clayton, experienced. Thorough. Exactly the kind of professional you'd want if you were trying to prove your deceased husband had cheated you out of millions. But the thing about forensic accountants is they follow the numbers wherever they lead. They don't find what you want them to find. They find what's there. And what was there, buried in 14 months of company records, was a pattern. We hired a better forensic accountant, and we knew exactly what he would find. 3 weeks into discovery, Clayton called me with news. His voice was calm, but I could hear something underneath the satisfaction of a plan coming together. Marcus Bell turned in his preliminary findings to Wendell Thornton this morning, Clayton said, and he went looking for evidence of fraudulent transfer, evidence that Wallace moved assets to deprive Lorraine of her inheritance. Clayton paused. Instead, he found vendor invoices that didn't match any deliveries, mileage reimbursements for routes that didn't exist, petty cash withdrawals with no documentation. I sat down. The kitchen chair creaked beneath me. He traced the discrepancies back 14 months. Inflated invoices from a sole proprietorship with no physical address, just a P.O. box in Wilmington. Payments routing through an LLC that was registered 6 months after Lorraine became administrative director. Let me guess, I said. The LLC has one signatory, Lorraine Holbrook. Clayton's voice was quiet now. She hired a forensic accountant to prove your father defrauded her. Instead, he found evidence that she'd been systematically embezzling from the company for over a year. I thought about my father sitting in his study those last months, making phone calls, compiling records, building a case he never intended to bring because he knew someone else would bring it for him. He'd seen this coming, all of it. The greed, the legal challenge, the investigation that would follow. He'd known exactly what Lorraine would do when she discovered the shell was empty, and he'd made sure that when she tried to fight, she'd expose herself. What happens now? I asked. Now, Clayton said, we wait for Wendell Thornton to explain this to his client, and then we see if she wants to keep fighting. I hung up the phone and looked out my kitchen window. The December sun was already setting. The trap had sprung. Clayton spread the forensic report across his desk like evidence at a crime scene, which, as it turned out, is exactly what it was. 2 days after the preliminary findings came in, I sat in his office watching him walk me through every page. The documents were dense, technical, filled with account numbers and transaction dates that would mean nothing to most people. But to a forensic accountant, they told a story. The invoices you flagged to your father back in 2023, Clayton said, tapping a highlighted section. This is where they went. The same vendor I'd questioned, Coastal Industrial Supply. The company with no website and no physical address. The forensic report had traced every payment, every fake delivery, every dollar that had flowed out of Holbrook Cold Chain Solutions and into a Nevada LLC with a Wilmington P.O. box. $287,000, Clayton said. Over 16 months. All traceable to an entity with one signatory. Lorraine. Lorraine, he set down the report. Your father knew. He just documented instead of confronting. He was building a case while she was building an inheritance claim. My father had known. He'd documented everything. And then he'd waited. I thought about the conversation we'd had in his office that October day in 2023. The way he'd shut me down when I raised questions about the invoices. The tired look in his eyes when he said he wasn't going to spend his remaining years auditing his own marriage. He hadn't been in denial. He'd been strategic. He'd let me think he was ignoring the problem so I wouldn't tip Lorraine off. All the while, he was quietly building the weapon that would destroy her case if she ever tried to take what he'd built. What happens now? I asked. Now we file these findings with the court. Clayton gathered the papers with the careful precision of a man who'd done this before. Not as a threat, not as leverage, as documentation affecting the augmented estate calculation. Meaning, meaning Lorraine is claiming she deserves a fair share of your father's estate. Under North Carolina law, the elective share is calculated based on the augmented estate, which includes assets that were fraudulently transferred, but it also accounts for assets that were stolen. The filing was a grenade with the pin already pulled. All Lorraine could do was decide whether to hold it or throw it back. If she stole nearly $300,000 from the company, Clayton continued, that reduces what she's entitled to claim. The court will factor in her misconduct when calculating any award. And Wendell Thornton. Wendell is a smart attorney. He's going to read this filing and understand exactly what it means. His client just handed us the ammunition to destroy her own case. The filing went out that afternoon. Clayton handled it the way he handled everything, professionally, precisely, without unnecessary drama. The documents spoke for themselves. Vendor invoices that didn't match deliveries, payments to a shell company, bank records showing where the money ultimately went. She'd been stealing from my father while he was dying. He'd been building a case while she was counting his money. I went home that night and made dinner something simple, pasta and sauce, the kind of meal you make when your mind is somewhere else entirely. I kept thinking about the timeline. Lorraine had started embezzling in early 2022. My father had noticed by mid-2023. He'd spent his last 18 months documenting her crimes while his heart was failing. He could have confronted her, could have filed charges, could have divorced her and cut her out entirely. Instead, he'd waited. He'd let her think she was getting away with it, and he'd made sure that when she finally made her move, she'd walk into a trap of her own making. 11 days after Clayton filed the forensic evidence, Wendell Thornton withdrew from the case. The withdrawal filing was brief, clinical, filled with standard legal language, cited conflict of interest, made no mention of the embezzlement evidence. But everyone in Charlotte's legal community understood what it meant. Wendell Thornton was a respected attorney. He didn't abandon clients mid-case unless continuing would damage his reputation. The polite legal translation, I refuse to be in the room when this gets worse. Lorraine needed new counsel. Within a week, she'd found someone. The attorney she hired was younger than Wendell, sharper, with a reputation for aggressive family law litigation. Her name was Miranda Caldwell, and according to Clayton, she was exactly the kind of lawyer you'd hire when you knew your position was indefensible, but weren't ready to admit it. She called this morning, Clayton told me on the phone. Wanted to discuss the case. What did she say? Not much. She's still reviewing the files. But I could hear it in her voice. She knows what she walked into. Will Lorraine keep fighting? That depends on how smart her new attorney is. Clayton paused. Miranda Caldwell is smart. She's going to look at the forensic evidence, look at the restructuring documentation, and understand that her client has two choices: negotiate a settlement or watch this become a criminal matter. I hung up the phone and looked out at the December sky. Gray clouds, winter coming. The end was approaching. I could feel it, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of something finally being resolved. Wendell Thornton's withdrawal filing was 3 pages of legal formality wrapped around a single truth: he was abandoning ship before it sank. Clayton showed me the document the day after it was filed. Standard language, boilerplate phrasing, nothing that would raise eyebrows in any courthouse. Conflict of interest was the stated reason. 3 words that meant something very specific in the legal world. I won't go down with you. The attorney who had promised aggressive litigation, who had threatened scorched earth if we contested the will, was now running from the fire he'd helped start. The forensic evidence had changed everything. Wendell Thornton had spent 30 years building his reputation. He wasn't going to sacrifice it defending a client whose own investigation had uncovered her crimes. He's protecting himself, Clayton said. Smart move, honestly. If he'd stayed on and the embezzlement became public, his judgment would be questioned. Better to walk away now. Wendell had threatened scorched earth. Now he was running before the flames reached him. Lorraine was left exposed. No attorney, no strategy, just a case file full of evidence that documented exactly what she'd done to the man she'd married. Within a week, she'd retained new counsel. Miranda Caldwell was a sharp-eyed attorney in her late 30s who specialized in cleaning up other lawyers' messes. I'd heard her name before. She had a reputation for taking difficult cases and finding exits where other attorneys saw only dead ends. Clayton knew her professionally. They'd been on opposite sides of a commercial dispute a few years back. "She's good," he told me. "Not flashy. Practical. She's going to look at this case and understand exactly what she's dealing with." What does it feel like to realize you've been outmaneuvered by a dead man? I imagined Lorraine sitting in Miranda Caldwell's office, watching her new attorney flip through the forensic report. Page after page of documentation. Bank records, invoice trails. The Nevada LLC with her signature on every filing. All of it assembled by a man she'd thought was too old, too tired, and too in love to notice what she was doing. She'd underestimated my father. That was her fundamental mistake. She'd seen a grieving widower with a failing heart and assumed vulnerability. She hadn't understood that Wallace Holbrook had spent 40 years outworking and outthinking everyone who'd ever tried to take something from him. Miranda Caldwell didn't waste time on false hope. "Miss Holbrook, I need you to understand something," she said. I learned this later from Clayton, who heard it from colleagues who knew Miranda's style. "Your negotiating position isn't weak. It's gone." Lorraine apparently didn't take this well. She'd hired Miranda expecting someone who would fight for her, not someone who would tell her the fight was already lost. "I have rights," Lorraine insisted. "I was his wife for 6 years. I'm entitled to—" "You're entitled to what the court decides you're entitled to." Miranda's voice was patient but firm. "And right now, the court has forensic evidence of substantial financial misconduct during your management of the company. That evidence doesn't go away because you don't like it. It was my compensation. Wallace never paid me what I deserved. That's not how embezzlement works, Ms. Holbrook." A pause. "The question isn't whether you're guilty. The question is what you can walk away with." Lorraine had spent years positioning herself to inherit everything. Now she was negotiating what she could keep. 3 weeks after taking the case, Miranda Caldwell called Clayton with a settlement proposal. The terms were simple. Lorraine would drop all elective share claims. She would accept the Lake Norman house and the personal accounts assets that were legitimately hers under the November will. She would sign a full release of any interest in the holding entity, the trust, and all business operations. In exchange, the embezzlement evidence would be treated as a settled matter, no criminal referral, no public disclosure beyond what was already in the court record. She'd walk away diminished, but not destroyed. Clayton brought the proposal to me on a Tuesday evening. We sat in his office with the settlement documents spread across his desk. December rain streaking the windows. "It's a good deal," he said. "For both sides, honestly. She gets to avoid prosecution. You get the company, the trust assets, and closure. What about the money she stole? That's the compromise. We don't pursue the stolen funds as a separate claim. The forensic evidence stays in the estate calculation. It reduces what she could have claimed, but we don't seek restitution." I looked at the documents. Clean language, professional formatting, a neat resolution to months of conflict. What would my father do? Clayton considered the question. "Your father built this trap so that if Lorraine pushed, she'd destroy herself. She pushed. She's destroyed." He paused. I think he'd say the purpose was protecting the company, not punishing her. The company is protected. The question is, whether you want more. I thought about Lorraine in her Lake Norman house, surrounded by furniture my father had paid for, living on accounts my father had filled. She'd get to keep some of what she'd schemed for, not all of it, not the empire she'd wanted, but enough. Was that justice? Was that enough? I need to think about it, I said. Clayton nodded. Take the time you need. But, Garrett, this is your decision, not your father's. He built the trap. You decide how it closes. The city lights were coming on outside Clayton's office window when he asked me the question I had been avoiding. What does justice look like to you? I'd spent 2 days thinking about the settlement proposal. 2 days of running numbers in my head, weighing outcomes, trying to separate what I wanted from what made sense. Now I was back in Clayton's office, December darkness falling outside, facing a decision that felt bigger than any contract I had ever signed. Walk me through it again, I said. Clayton nodded, patient as always. She drops all elective share claims. She signs a full release on the trust, the holding entity, and all business operations. She acknowledges that the November will transferred only the assets it contained, which is to say, nothing of operational value. And in exchange, she keeps what was legitimately hers under the will. The Lake Norman house worth around $900,000. Personal accounts totaling roughly $350,000. No criminal referral. More than $1 million for trying to steal everything my father built. For 6 years of scheming and 16 months of systematic theft. What is justice when the person who wronged you is already broken? She walks away with assets. Clayton continued. You walk away without a criminal referral process that could take years. Prosecutors might not even pursue it. The amounts are significant, but not spectacular by white-collar standards. You'd be tied up in depositions and court dates while the company needs you running operations. That's it. She just walks away. She walks away with less than she had before she started stealing. Clayton leaned back in his chair. The house and accounts were always hers under the will. She was going to get those regardless. What she wanted was the company. She doesn't get that. What she stole is documented. Her reputation in Charlotte is destroyed. People talk, and this story will follow her. I thought about my father, about what he would have wanted, about the 85 people who showed up to work every day without knowing any of this was happening, about Neil Ramsey and the crews who'd trusted Wallace Holbrook to build something stable. Does she deserve this? I asked. Clayton looked at me steadily. The question hung between us like smoke. Deserve is a theological question, Garrett. I'm a lawyer. He folded his hands on the desk. What I can tell you is this. Your father didn't structure all of this to punish Lorraine. He structured it to protect the business, the employees, the legacy, everything he built in 40 years. And if I want more, if I want her to face consequences, then we reject the settlement, refer the embezzlement evidence to the district attorney, and enter a process that could take 2 or 3 years. Maybe she gets prosecuted. Maybe she doesn't. Either way, you spend those years in court instead of building the company. He was right, and I knew it. But there was one thing missing. I stood up and walked to the window. Below, Central Avenue was thinning out as evening traffic gave way to the dinner crowd. People going home to families. People who didn't know or care about the drama playing out in law offices across the city. My father had spent his whole life building things. Not just the company, though, that was part of it. He'd built stability, security, a place where people could work honest jobs and know their paychecks would clear. That's what mattered to him. That's what he'd protected with all his careful planning. Lorraine had tried to take that. She'd failed. The company was safe. The employees were protected. The legacy continued. But she'd also stolen nearly $300,000. Money that should have gone to equipment upgrades, employee bonuses, operational improvements. Money that belonged to the business my father built. Protecting the company wasn't just about keeping Lorraine from owning it. It was about making sure what she took came back. I turned from the window. "I'll accept the settlement," I said. "With one modification." Clayton raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "She also repays the money she stole. Every dollar." The forensic audit documented the exact amount, $287,000. "If she wants to avoid criminal charges, she pays back what she took from my father's company." Clayton was silent for a moment. Then a small smile crossed his face. "That's going to hurt her," he said. "She'll have to liquidate something. Maybe take a mortgage on the house. It won't be comfortable." "Good. Her attorney will push back. Let her. The alternative is prosecution. Miranda Caldwell is smart enough to know that a restitution payment is better than a fraud conviction." Clayton nodded slowly. "I'll draft the counteroffer tonight. She'll have 48 hours to decide." I sat back down. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for weeks felt slightly lighter. Not gone. This wasn't triumph. Wasn't celebration. But it felt like resolution. Like an equation finally balancing. "My father would have approved," I said quietly. "Your father would have been proud," Clayton corrected. "Not just of the outcome, of how you got here. You protected the business. You protected the employees. And you made sure there were consequences." That's exactly what he would have done. I looked at the settlement documents on Clayton's desk. One modification. One requirement. Every dollar she stole, returned. That was justice. My justice. The only kind that mattered now. Clayton set down his pen and studied me like I'd just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. "You understand what you're asking," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm asking her to pay back what she stole." "You're asking her to sign a document that admits she stole from your father." Clayton's voice was careful, measured. "That's not just money, Garrett. That's her reputation. Her standing in society. The story she'll tell herself for the rest of her life." Late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across his desk. I watched the pattern shift as clouds moved outside. "She might reject the whole thing," Clayton continued. "Walk away from the settlement. Take her chances in court. People do irrational things when their self-image is threatened. Then she takes her chances, and we spend the next 2 years in litigation." I understood the risk. But I also understood something else. Something my father had taught me without ever putting it into words. My father used to say that a man who won't admit his mistakes is a man who'll keep making them. I met Clayton's eyes. "She doesn't get to walk away pretending she earned what she stole. That money came from the company, from the employees who worked for it, from 40 years of my father's life. She pays it back, or she faces charges." I realized, hearing myself speak, that I sounded exactly like him. For the first time in my life, that felt like praise rather than pressure. Clayton nodded slowly. "I'll send the counteroffer tonight. She has 48 hours. The next 2 days were the longest of the entire process. I went to work. I checked reports. I answered calls from Neil about operational issues that seemed impossibly trivial compared to what was happening in lawyers' offices across town. At Lake Norman, Miranda Caldwell delivered the amended settlement terms to Lorraine. I wasn't there, of course, but Clayton told me afterward what Miranda had reported. Lorraine's initial reaction was fury, cold, controlled. The kind of anger that comes from someone who's been cornered and knows it. "He wants me to confess," Lorraine said. "That's what this is. A confession. It's restitution, Miranda replied, framed as settlement of disputed accounting discrepancies. The language is careful. But everyone will know. Everyone who matters already knows. Through Lorraine's floor-to-ceiling windows, the winter lake reflected gray sky, the same view she was fighting to keep. You can pay the money quietly and retain what dignity remains, or you can reject this. Watch the forensic evidence become public record and see your name in the Charlotte Observer next to the word embezzlement. Lorraine went silent. Miranda waited. How long do I have? 48 hours. The call came at 6:15 on a Thursday morning. I was making coffee when my phone buzzed Clayton's name on the screen. She signed, he said. I set down my mug. Everything. Full settlement. Complete release of all claims. And the restitution payment, she's wiring the funds from her personal accounts today. Every dollar returned to the company my father built. I should have felt triumph. I should have felt vindication. Instead, I felt tired. Winning against family shouldn't feel like victory. It should feel like what it was. The aftermath of something that should never have happened. She signed at 4:47 this morning, Clayton continued. Miranda said she didn't sleep for 2 days. But it's done. Garrett. Every dollar accounted for. Every claim resolved. The business is yours, free and clear. I looked out my kitchen window at the December morning. Frost on the grass, weak sunlight trying to break through. What happens now? Now we file the settlement with the court. The estate closes. The restructuring stands. Holbrook Industrial Holdings, the real company, continues operations under your control. A pause. It's over. Over. Months of legal warfare, weeks of strategy, years of Lorraine's scheming. All of it finished in a phone call at dawn. There's one more thing, Clayton said, his voice careful now. What? She included a letter with the signed documents, handwritten. She asked me to give it to you, but only after the settlement was finalized. I gripped the phone tighter. A letter? I have it here. You can pick it up whenever you're ready. I drove to Clayton's office that afternoon. The December traffic was light. Holiday travelers already gone. The city settling into that quiet stretch between Christmas and New Year's when nothing much happens. Clayton handed me the envelope without comment. My name was written on the front in careful cursive Lorraine's handwriting. The same handwriting I'd seen on corporate documents for years. The same handwriting on my father's death certificate. I turned it over in my hands. Sealed. Waiting. I'll give you the room, Clayton said, standing. Take whatever time you need. He closed the door behind him. I was alone with the envelope, the settlement documents, and the knowledge that whatever Lorraine had written, it was the last communication we'd ever have. I thought about not opening it, about throwing it away unread, about denying her even the satisfaction of being heard. But that wasn't who my father raised me to be. He'd taught me to face things directly, to understand, even when understanding hurt. I slid my finger under the seal and opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages. No apology, no explanation. Just Lorraine's version of events, how she'd felt invisible in my father's marriage, how she'd convinced herself she was owed compensation, how she'd never intended for it to go this far. I read it once, folded it, and put it in my desk drawer. Not thrown away, not answered. Just filed. Like everything else from this chapter, the pen felt heavier than it should have. 14 weeks of warfare reduced to a single signature on a Wednesday morning. I sat in Clayton's office with the final settlement documents spread before me. January light filtered through the blinds, cold and clear. The paperwork was thick, releases, acknowledgments, transfer confirmations. Everything that had consumed the last 3 months, distilled into signatures and notary stamps. "Once you sign, it's done," Clayton said. "No appeals, no reversals. She gets her assets, you get the company, and neither of you ever has to speak again." She requested that specifically. No contact clause. Her attorney insisted. Clayton's voice was neutral. "Lorraine never wants to see or hear from you again, as if erasing you completes her escape." I signed the first document, then the second, then the rest, one after another, until the stack was complete. Was this victory? It felt more like surviving a car crash and being handed the keys to drive home. 14 weeks ago, I buried my father, I said, setting down the pen. Today, I bury everything else. Clayton gathered the documents with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd closed 1,000 cases. "The estate is settled. The restructuring stands. The restitution funds will be deposited into the company operating account by end of business today." I stood, shook his hand, and walked out of his office into the January afternoon. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. I got in my truck and drove north, toward Concord. The facility looked the same as it had for 20 years. Same chain-link fence, same parking lot, same loading docks where trucks came and went with refrigeration units bound for restaurants and warehouses across 3 states. Neil was waiting for me inside, clipboard in hand. The same steady presence he'd been since my father hired him 12 years ago. "How'd it go?" he asked. "It's done." He nodded, understanding everything that single word contained. "Walk with me." We moved through the facility together, past the service bays, the parts warehouse, the dispatch office where schedulers coordinated routes across the Carolinas. The refrigeration units hummed their constant song, cold air preserving what mattered, same as it had for 42 years. "Every truck's running," Neil said. "Every client's paid. Every employee showed up this morning." He stopped, turned to face me. "Your father built something that doesn't break easy." He'd hate that I almost let her take it. "No, sir." Neil's voice was firm. "He'd be proud you didn't." I stayed after Neil left, walking the warehouse floor alone. Forklifts sat idle, waiting for the morning shift. The industrial lights cast everything in harsh white. The air smelled like machine oil and cold. The smell I'd grown up with. The smell that meant my father was at work. This was mine now. Not just legally, not just on paper. Mine to run. Mine to protect. Mine to build on. My father's company. My company now. The words still felt borrowed, but less so than yesterday. I stopped near the loading dock doors and caught my reflection in the warehouse window. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. The posture was wrong. Too straight, too deliberate. The stance was different. Then I realized I was standing exactly the way my father used to stand. Hands at my sides, shoulders square, chin up. The position of a man surveying something he'd built. I hadn't learned it consciously. It had just happened. Somewhere in the last 14 weeks of fighting for everything he'd left behind. I'd become the man Wallace Holbrook trained me to be. And for the first time, that didn't feel like pressure. It felt like inheritance. The sun was setting behind the facility, painting the loading dock in gold and shadow. I locked the warehouse doors, checked the security panel, and walked to my truck. My phone buzzed as I reached for the door handle. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "Your father helped me once. I'd like to return the favor. Dinner, Friday." No name, no context. Just an invitation from someone who knew Wallace Holbrook well enough to wait until the settlement was public record before reaching out. I stared at the message. My father had helped a lot of people over 40 years. Employees who needed advances, clients who needed patience, contractors who needed second chances. Any one of them could have sent this. Or it could be something else entirely. I pocketed the phone without responding. The mystery could wait. Tonight, I had something more important to do. I drove home, made my father's breakfast for dinner. Eggs, toast, black coffee, and sat at the kitchen table as darkness fell outside. Everything Dad built was still running. The company, the legacy, the lessons he'd spent my whole life teaching me. And so was I. I never answered that mysterious text. Some invitations are better left unopened. Whoever sent it, whatever favor they wanted to return, would have to find another way. I had enough of my father's unfinished business to sort through without adding more. The compressors hummed like they always have, the same low drone my father heard every morning for 42 years. The sound of 85 families staying fed. I walked the perimeter of the Concord facility as the January sun began its slow descent. The air was cold, carrying the industrial smell of refrigerant and machine oil. My breath fogged in front of me, the same air my father had breathed on 1,000 walks just like this one. Neil found me near the loading docks, clipboard tucked under his arm. "Your father walked this route every Friday," he said, falling into step beside me. Said it reminded him why the paperwork mattered. All those contracts and invoices, they were just words on paper, until you walked the floor and saw the trucks, the equipment, the people. I didn't know that. He didn't talk about it much, just did it. 42 years of Fridays. Neil looked out at the facility. The warehouse, the service bays, the parking lot full of refrigeration trucks. "I've got a lot of catching up to do." "So do I." Neil nodded, said nothing else, and headed back inside. He understood. Some things didn't need words. The compressors don't know Wallace is gone. They just keep humming, keeping things cold, keeping things preserved. Maybe that's the point. You build something that works, and it keeps working after you're not there to tend it. I stood alone in the fading light, thinking about everything that had happened since October. My father's death, Lorraine's betrayal, the courtroom where Wendell Thornton's confidence collapsed, the settlement that closed a chapter I'd never wanted to write. 3 months. It felt like years. My father's voice echoed in my head. Not words he'd ever said directly, but lessons I'd absorbed without realizing. You can love someone and still read the contract. You can trust and still verify. He'd known that. Lorraine had taught me why. He wasn't cold. He was careful. There's a difference. All those years I'd resented his demands, his high standards, his refusal to accept anything less than excellence. I understood now. He wasn't preparing me to run a refrigeration company. He was preparing me for the moment when someone I trusted would try to take everything he'd built. How many breakfasts did he make alone, thinking about the son who wouldn't return his calls? How many Friday walks around this facility, wondering if I'd ever understand what he was trying to teach me? I'd been so focused on proving I wasn't him that I'd missed how much of him was already in me. The sun dropped below the tree line. The security lights flickered on, casting the parking lot in orange glow. I walked back to my truck, locked the facility gates, and drove home through the winter darkness. The next morning, I made his breakfast: scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. The same meal Wallace Holbrook had made every day for as long as I could remember. I'd watched him prepare it 1,000 times, standing at the stove in his work clothes, already thinking about the day ahead. The eggs sizzled in the pan. The coffee percolated on the counter. The toast browned in the same toaster he'd owned for 20 years. Simple sounds, simple smells. The ordinary rituals that hold a life together. I make his breakfast every morning now. Not because he asked, because I finally understand why he did. It's not about the food. It's about the discipline, the routine, the commitment to showing up day after day and doing the work that needs to be done. My father built a company the same way he made breakfast, one morning at a time, one decision at a time, until the accumulated weight of all those small choices became something that couldn't be easily destroyed. If you're listening, Dad, I get it now. Every lesson, every lecture, every time you pushed me harder than I wanted to be pushed. I finally get it. I poured the black coffee into his mug, the one that still said, "World's okayest boss." A gift from the employees years ago. He'd laughed when he opened it. One of the few times I'd seen him genuinely surprised. Somewhere out there, Lorraine was waking up in her Lake Norman house. She'd paid back what she stole. She'd signed away any claim to the company. She'd lost the empire she'd spent 6 years trying to take. I didn't wish her well, but I didn't wish her harm either. That felt like progress. I sat at my kitchen table as morning light filled the room. The coffee was hot. The eggs were perfect. The toast was exactly the shade of brown my father preferred. Outside, Charlotte was waking up, traffic building, people heading to jobs, life continuing the way it always does. The company was running. The employees were secure. The legacy was protected. And I was still here, still standing, still building. That's how you build something that lasts. One morning at a time. And to you, listening to my story, remember this family isn't always what you expect it to be. Looking back on my own life story, I see the mistakes I almost made. I almost let anger consume me. I almost fought battles that weren't worth fighting. I almost forgot that protecting what my father built was more important than punishing the woman who tried to take it. Don't make my mistake of waiting until someone is gone to finally understand what they were trying to teach you. This revenge story taught me something I'll carry forever. You can love someone and still read the contract. You can trust and still verify. My father spent his final months building a fortress around everything he loved, not out of cruelty, but out of wisdom. I believe God put me through this life story for a reason. Maybe that reason was to share it with you today. Every lesson, every hardship, every moment of betrayal shaped me into the man my father always believed I could be. If this revenge story touched something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have accepted the settlement or pushed for more? Your perspective matters to me. If you know someone facing their own family struggle, please share this life story with them. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time and attention mean more than you know. As always, some details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. What matters is the message, and I hope this one stays with you.